Hello, everyone. Hi, everyone. I've been instructed that we need to start so that at some point we can have lunch. So hello, everyone. I'm not sure where the camera is for the Zoom people. I hope they can all right. Well, the Zoom people can hear me. Hi, everyone. Thanks for staying or coming back. My name is Michalis Kavarazis from Manchester Metropolitan University. That's all you need to know for now. And I'm going to be chairing this session, which includes three, I'm sure you will agree with me, fascinating presentations. I've read the papers. I don't know if you have. And I think there's a lot to look forward to in this session. It's about the business of branding and tourism, right? That is our topic. And our first presenter is no bios, according to our organizers here, right? You can all check everyone's biographical note in the proceedings. Rory, you are first. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear and see me. The Zoom is on at this side, so we're good to begin. Closer to the mic. Okay, very good. So yeah, the paper is called Private Entrepreneurs in a Socialist State, Albanian Small Businesses on Yugoslavia's Adriatic Coast During the Cold War. I'd firstly ask, who here has been to the Croatian seaside at some point? Okay, so it's like more than a third of the group. And so if you've ever had a coffee on the Croatian seaside, certainly eaten an ice cream or maybe a fish dinner, the chances are that if you've done it multiple times, that at least some of those times it was in an Albanian-owned private business catering to tourists, and that's the topic of the paper and of my talk today. So Yugoslavia, of course, was a socialist state which was not a member of the Warsaw Pact, and it was the only Mediterranean country actually where tourists from both sides of the Cold War divide could holiday in significant numbers. And it's also notable as being a socialist state which enabled the functioning of a legal private sector. So this is something which was allowed by law. Now, although the state, or the social sector as it was called, took the lead in facilitating mass tourism, private businesses like these ice cream vendors, cafe owners, souvenir shops and jewelers, they also filled in the gaps and then responded to the market demands of tourism in Yugoslavia. On the Adriatic coast in Croatia, many operators of these businesses were Yugoslav Albanians. So today I'm speaking about Albanians, but I'm only speaking about Albanians who were citizens of Yugoslavia, not citizens of then rather closed socialist Albania. These are citizens of Yugoslavia. There was about a little bit more than 2 million Albanians in Yugoslavia. So there's probably 1 in 10 Yugoslavs is actually Albanian in a national sense. And so these were usually fairly recent migrants from the southeast of the country. So that's Kosovo and what today is Northern Macedonia, then the Socialist Republic of Macedonia. And they were overrepresented as entrepreneurs in this sort of small but functional private sector. So this is based on an ongoing research project looking at Yugoslav Albanian migration to Croatia. And I'm relying on the triangulation of archival documents, printed press and oral history interviews. And so most of the oral history interviews I'm doing is in Istria, the sort of the northwestern peninsula in Croatia, which is has a very big tourist industry. So sort of, even though I wouldn't consider myself a sort of a historian of tourism, sort of indirectly this is, I'm dealing with questions of tourism in this research project. And sort of, I suppose the main argument here in this paper is that the case study of Albanian private entrepreneurs were important transnational nodes in Cold War era cross-block tourism. So the main argument is that these Albanian-owned private businesses on the coast facilitated microeconomic activity and mobility between non-aligned Yugoslavia, capitalist liberal democracies of Western Europe, and neighboring Warsaw Pact countries as well. So Yugoslavia was unofficially branded for the rest of Eastern Europe as the most Western-like state that citizens of Warsaw Pact countries like Czechoslovakia and Poland could enter rather freely during state socialism. So the coast was a site where Eastern European tourists from places like Czechoslovakia and Hungary could engage in the consumption of Western or Western-like products and imports and other consumer goods which were restricted or unavailable in their home countries. And these were often facilitated, these exchanges were facilitated often by Albanian tourist workers, for example, jewelry, which I mentioned in the paper, but gold and silver, but also hard currency and other goods too. So the paper is part of a much larger research project. It's a 4-year research project with 2 employees, which looks at the social and labor history of Albanians and internal migration within Yugoslavia during socialism through an intersectional lens. And the logic here is that there's a very large literature looking at Albanian migration in the post-socialist era. So for example, from Albania and Kosovo to places like Greece and Italy and Germany, but we actually know very little about socialist era migration within Yugoslavia, even those are fairly significant numbers. So it's probably between 50 to 200,000 Albanians migrated within the country, I mean, to Slovenia and to Croatia. And so I'm looking at the politicization of this migration in the 1980s and the way that it was structured by class, racialized ethnicity, and gender. So in terms of the case that I'm looking at, so Albanian migration to Yugoslavia, to Croatia from the Yugoslav southeast. So a rough periodization would see Yugoslav Albanians moving to Croatia after World War II. Initially in the 1950s and 60s, tended to be craftspeople, small business owners, and also some workers. This is usually sort of institutionally invisible. It was facilitated through kin networks and chain migration, and this really went fairly external to the institutions of the party state and self-management. So it's actually quite hard to reconstruct in terms of documents. Then with the rapid development of industry, including tourism in Croatia during the 1960s and 70s, many more joined their compatriots in Croatia, and word would spread in villages and towns in Kosovo and North Macedonia about opportunities on the coast. Young men could find seasonal work in hospitality coming from May until September. And yeah, others would do so through connections with relatives. People would also find work in construction, and quite often families might sell a small portion of their agricultural land so they could then actually open a business in the country. So from the biographical details, which are contained in archival documents and oral history interviews that I've completed with Albanians in Croatia in the last couple of years, there isn't a sort of single dominant trajectory of Albanian migration. What seems to be perhaps most common is this practice of selling a limited amount of what was then actually very highly priced agricultural land in Macedonia and Kosovo, and then using these funds to open a business in Croatia, while still maintaining the household, which would be working in agriculture. As one narrator, Safed Kadri, whose pictures he's kindly provided with that I've put up on this slide, he recalls in the 1970s and 80s, land was highly priced. And I remember in the 1980s, the sale of a 2,500 meter piece of land in the Tetovo region was enough to buy an old ruin, kind of a former stable in a tourist town in the Adriatic for 50, 70 or 100,000 Deutschmarks, and then to turn this into a business premises. Other Albanian business owners had worked in Western Europe and had raised capital in this way, and then returned to Yugoslavia to open a business in the Adriatic coast, while simultaneously maintaining a household in Kosovo or Macedonia, but also maybe having sort of one leg in the emigre community in Western Europe as well. So again, Kadri explains that after 1969, many more people went to Germany. They'd send money back. So one son might stay there in West Germany, send money home, while others would open a business on the Adriatic coast. And then, like, as I mentioned, the 70s and 80s, the numbers of migrants increased even more so, and it tended that entire families would move, whereas previously it would just be single males. Probably the most numerous category of migrants to Croatia was actually those who worked on a seasonal basis, usually in a very casual and insecure way, like day laboring construction. But the focus here is on those small business owners working in tourism and the people that they employed as well. So most Yugoslavs found work in the so-called social sector, the equivalent of the state sector in other socialist countries, but Albanians in Croatia and elsewhere tended to be disproportionately employed in the private sector. So many found employment by opening private businesses, which would specialize in hospitality and crafts. Goldsmiths and silversmiths were quite common, and sellers of fruit and vegetables, and informal labor in construction, small construction companies too. Now, the local authorities in Croatia made a direct link between the slightly suspect, though legal category of private business owner and alleged networks of Albanian nationalists and more general criminality. And by the 1980s, Albanian migration was heavily securitized within Croatia and became sort of one of many focuses of their secret police. So Here I'll provide an English version of this quote. This is from the security services in Pula, who were reporting on a so-called Albanian complex in the late 1980s. And this reveals sort of a cognitive link on the part of the authorities between Albanian-owned private businesses, criminality, tourism, and the proximity of the Yugoslav borders with Western European states. So the report states, and there's many of these reports, this is just one example, the most interesting group are those owners of private businesses, ice cream parlors, jewelers. Due to their exceptionally high material status, it's indisputable that such a status is partly the consequence of one's own work in combination with favorable conditions of a touristed region, which enables the gaining of an enviable financial result. However, information received also suggests that a meaningful number of Albanian owners of private businesses gain huge earnings on the basis of malversations, illegal currency exchange, bypassing regulations, and especially through smuggling. The problem of smuggling various goods is widespread, including smuggling and weapons. For these businesses, further opportunities are offered by the fact that it is a border region, it's close to Italy and Austria, and the large frequency of foreigners and the possibilities enabled by local border traffic. So we can see this is the sort of the default view of the authorities by the 1980s. But how did the workers, Albanian private business owners themselves, see their position in Croatia and their relationship to the state and institutions of self-managing socialism? Well, responding to questions of this, most Albanian narrators stress a very strong work ethic and familial entrepreneurial spirit, and this was not conducive to engaging with the existing political structures of the times. This is why many describe like not engaging with sort of the local politics. And that from socialist times and right up to the current day when I've been conducting interviews, getting up early and staying late at the family business is juxtaposed by Albanian narrators against the more predictable and much shorter hours of workers in the Croatian public sector. Now, moving on to private business owners and Cold War border crossing. So Sabit Kadri, this sort of narrator that I've mentioned already, he's the owner of a large ice cream parlor in the tourist settlement of Medellin near Pula. And he describes how when his late father and uncle started the business in 1959, the first customers were locals, local Istrians. And only with the asphalting of the main road to the nearby city of Pula and the construction of the first hotel in 1969, tourism took off in the village and then sort of mushroomed in the 1970s. And then the business itself began to orient itself more robustly towards visiting tourists, both domestic Yugoslav tourists and international tourists from both sides of the Iron Curtain. So these customers were instrumental, like not only in providing the family with an income, like through their purchase of ice creams and other sweet snacks, but also as sources for certain goods which were in short supply. So, in this sort of context of economy of shortage and uneven supply of materials was a perennial issue affecting most private businesses. But then by the 1980s, the economic crisis then accentuated this. So previously, going back to the 60s, the Safed recalls that most of the raw ingredients could be bought or bartered for local. So this is just, buying milk from local villagers in order to make ice cream. But as the business grew in the late 70s and then in the 1980s, it was actually difficult to get these items in a larger scale. So coffee was something which was in regularly in shortage. He says, you needed to know the boss of the warehouse in Pula to keep some coffee aside from you. But by the 1980s, tourists or regular guests would bring me coffee, 5 or 10 kilos. These are mostly Italians. He also mentioned that he had a friend, an Austrian tourist, who worked in a coffee processing plant in Austria. And then he taught him how to make sort of the best blends of basically to combine different blends of coffee to make it last as long as possible. So unlike Adelina's research in the previous panel, these were not usually termed as gifts or presents, but rather as sort of collaborative exchanges, basically small-scale economic exchanges without too much kind of, emotional investment on either side, but still, conditioned by friendships and knowledge done through like friends of friends. So with the Italian border just a couple of hours drive from Pula, where Safed still has his ice cream parlor, he would travel regularly to Italy, and then he'd buy necessary items for the business, things like bananas and kiwis, which he could buy in Trieste, which were not available in Yugoslavia at the time. And he'd also keep himself informed of industry developments at events like the annual ice cream culinary fair in Rimini. And he showed examples of these menu cards of pictures of fruit cups, which he first got in 1981. These are a little bit newer, they're priced in Croatian kuna, but he said basically it's the same pictures. Now, it wasn't only tourists from Italy or Austria who'd help mitigate this economy of shortage in the 1980s. Tourists from the other side of the Iron Curtain also played a role. He said that you could not buy citric acid in Yugoslavia in the 1980s. This is something which is in chronic shortage. And we got some though, through a Czechoslovak. He'd come and offer me half a kilo and I would buy it from him. So you have, Czech tourists bringing things from their country as well, which were in shortage in Yugoslavia. In the longer version on this paper, I have also an example of Albanian business people who acted as go-betweens for small-scale transactions across Iron Curtain borders, making use of Yugoslavia's third-way status. I think the example I have is of Albanians with businesses in Croatia, but also in Austria, acting as go-betweens between Bratislava in Czechoslovakia and Vienna in Austria, so that money and some goods for ice cream shops could travel from Bratislava down to Zagreb, into Italy, up to Austria and back again. So kind of a fairly long way to go a distance, which is only an hour by train today. As historian Igor Duda observes in his study of tourism and socialism, Yugoslavia for the rest of Europe, Eastern Europe, left the impression of being the most Western-like state that citizens of Warsaw Pact countries could more or less freely enter. And as a site where they could engage in the consumption of Western or Western-like imports and other consumer goods unavailable in home countries, such as jewelry made by Albanian gold and silversmiths. And we see kind of a symbiotic relationship of exchange emerging in the 1980s and even right into the 1990s between Albanian business owners of these jewelers, of goldsmiths and silversmiths, and Czechoslovak customers. So in the decades after World War II, many goldsmiths left Kosovo to try their luck in cities in Croatia and Bosnia, particularly on the Croatian coast. And then older filigrani like one Agustin Putici, whose son runs their business today in the center of Rovinj, a popular tourist city in the north of Croatia. This is a picture of his, on the slide here, it's a picture of the business when it opened, I think in the early 1960s. So their initial, a bit like Safi Kadri and the ice cream customers, the initial customers tended to be local Istrians. This is in the years before mass tourism. They'd buy jewelry like wedding rings for special events. But then as the 1970s and 1980s came along, the most important tourists for this branch were actually those behind the Iron Curtain, from Czechoslovakia and from Hungary. So Butici claims, and I'm citing him, that they were thirsty for jewelry given sort of the very limited selection and offer in their home countries. As another jeweler explains, that goldsmiths in Czechoslovakia were very limited during socialism. He said, you couldn't simply buy a wedding ring in Czechoslovakia. You had to announce it to the municipality, make an order. It would take 6 months for them to order it, whereas we could sell them one immediately. So it was the best market in Europe for our craft. So the 1980s are remembered as being kind of a favorable time for these goldsmiths and silversmiths, maybe not as good as the 1970s when there was even more money in circulation, but it was still possible to make a decent living. But with the end of socialism in Eastern Europe, the most important customer base could now, which was Czechoslovaks, Hungarians, could now buy in their home countries. And he says, when the Berlin Wall fell, then we could really feel the crisis. With countries like Czechoslovakia and Hungary open, we lost that market. So I think I have a longer version of the paper as well about sort of the after story with the breakup of Yugoslavia. Many of these Albanian business owners found themselves in a very insecure position because overnight they were citizens of a foreign country in many cases, in this case Serbia, which was at war with Croatia. And so what did many of them do? Czechoslovakia, and they opened up businesses in Prague and in Brno and other cities. And they had already made these kind of connections with people there in the 1970s and 1980s. So this is kind of a logical place for them to go. And apparently the first wave of them who went there became extremely rich from this. So you can see how these sort of Cold War connections could sort of mitigate political economic changes and crisis after 1989 as well. So just to conclude, being the same federative state, labor and goods could flow freely across Yugoslavia, so between Kosovo, Macedonia and Croatia, whereas the proximity then of Croatia to Italy and Austria and the presence of large numbers of foreign tourists could offer economic opportunities, and Albanians often provided goods and services to these tourists. And they served tourists from both sides of Cold War divide, and explained how tourists from some states like Hungary and Czechoslovakia were important consumers of certain products, but also could sell them products as well that they needed for their business. And unlike this, the social sector, the equivalent of the state sector, Albanian family businesses operated without clear oversight from the Yugoslav League of Communists, and thus they're a source of suspicion for the authorities, particularly after 1981, when there was mass demonstrations in Kosovo and Albanians were investigated due to sort of alleged nationalist behavior across the country, including in Croatia as well. And yeah, Albanians themselves stress hard work and contrast their own long hours and entrepreneurial spirit to what they claim as idleness on the part of the social or public sector workers. And they express particular attitudes regarding embodied labor and a kind of a value of labor which doesn't easily fit into the factory-oriented labor history of socialist Yugoslavia. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rory. What an amazing piece of history, I think. I'm always fascinated by how individual and family histories become collective national histories. I imagine the Safet, I think his name was, driving his Justava down to Rimini to find the ice creams or the fairs that you were saying, or the Czechs buying their wedding rings in the Croatia, in the Adriatic coast. That's fascinating. We have decided that we will have a discussion after each paper this time, just for a change, right? So I just want to start with one question that I have, and then I will open it for the floor. Can I ask you just to put it in the branding, the national branding kind of context? You say that at that time, Yugoslavia was sort of branded, if we want, as the most Western-like state of, well, former Eastern Europe, whatever that means. Do you think that this was one of the reasons why this trade sort of flourished there, or was it relevant at all? Did that provide some sort of background for the whole thing? Just one comment on that, because you're from Graz, from the University of Graz, and I know there was a similar situation in Lake Balaton in Hungary, which was not branded as a very Western kind of state, but similar trade was happening over there as well. So what do you think was the role of this national brand?
National branding. This is a difficult one, because I think that in the case of Albanians, these businesses were almost unbranded, in the sense that they were sort of operating, I mean, legally, but under the radar, in the sense that they were often, unless you saw like a small picture of Mother Teresa, or there was very little sign that these are Albanian owned and operated, and this was often played down. Often these would be kind of Italian oriented, if you think of restaurants. So I'm not sure how branding as a kind of, if it can do very much work for this case, because what might be more interesting, and I don't know the answer to this, I've been asking some colleagues like Anita, who'll be speaking tomorrow, and Igor Duda, actually about how Yugoslavia was perceived and branded in Eastern European countries in terms of tourism. I mean, it was very well known not only as a place to go on holiday, but as a place to trade. Particularly in the 1980s, there was people coming from Poland to towns near the Yugoslav border to sell antiques, to sell different goods, and then to buy things on the open market. So I think it was maybe not branded in a top-down way through tourism authorities, but it was very well known that Yugoslavia is a place where business could be done, things could be exchanged, and also as a place of, I think, enjoyment of pleasure and leisure too. And I think there's probably lots of sites like Balaton and other maybe parts of the Romanian, Bulgarian seaside where different forms of exchange could take place. And I'm guessing that these were really increasing over the 1980s as well. But for branding, it's still a little bit fuzzy from my side.
I think that's why we're here to discuss all that. So, Irini.
We're going to do so much exercise. Okay, thank you so much, Rory, for the paper. I agree with what you said and Mihaly said. What you have here is not top-down branding in a way or tourist practice, but it's from below and it's completely not orchestrated. It has an economic benefit, but actually works in an informal and unconscious way, but it does work. So the fact that that's not the purpose does not negate it is important. And I think that should come much more forward in the paper. The fact that they're private gives them still an agency, which, you know, the state doesn't want to acknowledge, but it's there. Therefore, the question is here, because from what you say, you're doing these interviews, or there seems to be an oral history project that you are running, if I understood that. Apologies if I didn't. But what I would love to hear is that how are those private business people are interacting with the tourists? Because here you get a window into what different kind of tourists are thinking when they are having this exchange and this kind of encounter at that point. And you never get that kind of, and I was wondering if that is part of the questionnaire or part of what you're asking. So it's not just what they were trying to do, but while they were selling and while they were consuming during that moment, they were connecting at some point. They were getting this different kind of tourists across the Iron Curtain, different countries. They were in a melting pot, but all coming with different kind of ideas. And I was wondering, is that part of the project? It didn't seem in the paper, but I did wonder about that. Thank you.
Oh, okay, thank you. Can I respond immediately before the question goes? So yeah, I think this sort of informal unconscious way is very important. I should maybe stress this more. And being a private worker, privatnik, I mean, it does give agency and people express this. And I even have a few examples where the state or kind of the state bodies almost admit this as well. I have, one very good example in the local newspaper in a tourist town, this leading tourist town of Yugoslavia at the time, Porridge, where one of the sort of, the political functionaries is actually complaining that the social sector is much too lazy and saying that, after 9 p.m., the only businesses that are open are Albanian private businesses. We should take a leaf from their book and actually, put the same effort. So there is every now and again a kind of an acknowledgement that this is working. In terms of the interactions between the business owners and the tourists, it's not the main focus by any means. I mean, the main focus of the project is to actually give agency to these individual people, because there's a lot sort of, known in general about them, but nothing specifically, and a lot of things are ascribed to them. So my emphasis, like through this oral history, is to that people describe their own sort of migration experience and their own work and labor in their own terms and categories that make sense to them. And I try to tease that out. When I've spoken about tourism, it seems to be, I get quite shallow responses. Things like, oh yeah, we can speak loads of different languages. Communication's never a problem. There is some cases, I think, individual cases where, one narrator who I spoke with for a couple of times for quite a few hours, whose wife is Dutch, and this way is quite interesting because when they got together in the 1980s, she just considers him another Yugoslav man. But of course, being an Albanian is not the same as being a Croatian in the Yugoslav context. So they discuss that. So there are some individual cases, but nothing kind of that I could generalize about, I think, in terms of how they viewed the different tourists. There's probably quite a bit of, generally in Yugoslavia, sort of hierarchies about, all these poor kind of Hungarians and Romanians compared to, I don't know, to Italians, but there's also poor Germans too with their bad style. So there's a lot of these kind of stereotypes play a role too.
Thank you, Rory, for this really wonderful presentation. I was wondering, I wanted to ask you about the status of Albanians in Yugoslavia. So had the state-specific policies regarding this minority, right? In terms of national branding, were they branding themselves as Yugoslavs or as Albanians? It's something maybe an avenue that you can pursue. Somehow, what's specific about Albanians, if there is something specific about Albanians as private entrepreneurs in Yugoslavia, in socialist Yugoslav state, practically, right?
Okay. Yep.
And I was also wondering, how did they advertise themselves and through which channels they would do that directly or through the state channels?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the status of Albanians in Yugoslavia was tended to be pretty poor. It depends when and where exactly. The reason that I've chosen to focus the research project both on Slovenia and Croatia and not in Serbia, which would be the most logical place in some ways, because many Albanians did also move to Serbia, to Belgrade in particular, to work. But one of the reasons to do so is actually also to highlight the kind of the anti-Albanianism. It's not something which Serbia has a monopoly on. And if you look at Slovenia and Croatia, particularly in the 1980s, there's extremely racialized, racist discourses about Albanians, and it stems from many factors. Albanians within Yugoslavia had the status of narodnost, or a sort of a person who has a category of people of, I suppose, a minority which has an external homeland. So similar to Hungarians or to Turks, also to Roma. Of course, Roma don't have an external homeland. So they had a kind of, let's say, officially a constitutionally slightly lower status in terms of having external homeland. There's also Hodja's Albania was seen as an enemy country. So you have that aspect. Also, many Albanians were Muslim, but not all actually. And one of the things I'm finding out is in this research, a lot of the Albanians who came to Croatia also did so for religious reasons, but then were discriminated against when they came as practicing Catholics, and found that in socialist era history, this wasn't very welcome, and they were kind of looked down upon for this too. So I think there's lots of different sources of hostilities towards Albanians, but we shouldn't also forget that they are Yugoslavs in the sense they're coming from a foreign, a common country, often who had finished schooling in Serbo-Croatian. So I think in terms of like advertising, it was definitely underplaying Albanians, and there's sort of an emphasis to appeal to there being a Yugoslav. If it was for foreign tourists, this would be a Yugoslav. Domestically, it would be maybe a little bit relying on Mediterranean culture, particularly Italian culture, in terms of things like restaurants, ice cream, these kind of sort of the good life from Italy. Did I answer? I feel like I've forgotten a part. Okay, thanks.
Many questions.
Yeah, you can include Greece to the view of Albania, the racism in the 1980s, 90s, particularly. But my question was that, do you have numbers? Okay, I'm an economic historian and I count. First, and second, what were the places? I mean, where were the destinations that were apart from Dubrovnik that I know? There are wonderful islands. Were there some more? So, at what places did they establish themselves more? If you can do that,
I can answer that.
Or if you have, or is it an idea to get to one place and see how many? But yes.
Okay, so very simply, the numbers are hugely problematic because they were never properly compiled. The thing is, because this is migration within a single country, there was no need to get, a visa or permission. From about 1953 onwards, there was freedom of movement from Albanian inhabited parts of Yugoslavia across the country. And what happened is many people didn't register their presence in the place they came to. I think looking in the 1980s, there was some figures were flying about. It was probably about 50,000 Albanian migrants in the Croatian seaside and in Slovenia at that time. But the problem is many people came for a seasonal period, or many people didn't register. I've come across figures, for example, the secret police in Croatia in the 1980s, they were able to locate Albanian registered businesses. And sometimes you had more businesses registered than Albanian inhabitants. So for places like Cres, Krk, and the area of Kvarner in this northern part of Croatia, you have this sort of strange situation where there's actually more businesses registered than permanent inhabitants. So it's something that in a paper I can tease it out, but there isn't reliable figures. And in general, I'm using sort of this idea that there's institutional invisibility and that many of the authorities didn't really care until about 1981 because of political reasons. In terms of where they went to in Croatia, this is more specific. I've been focusing my research on, okay, I won't bring it up now, but it's the, actually, this part of, this northern part of Croatia here. It's the part which then and still today has the highest proportion of Albanians within the country. It's not a huge amount. In the cities, it's maybe 3-4%, but they were the most numerous in this part of Croatia. They were also present in places like Dubrovnik and Split and other tourist centers, but as a proportion of the population, more so in Poreč, Rovinj, Rijeka, Pula, this part of Croatia.
Thank you very much. I think I will need to be mean. There were 2 more questions, but then we need to be fair to the other 2 presenters, and I will have to just interrupt here the discussion. Thank you very much, Rory. Another time. The next paper is going to be presented by Stella Klado, a paper that they have worked on together with Maria Psimuli, who couldn't be with us today. Stella, the floor is yours. And I hope you will catch Rory in the break afterwards and ask all the questions.
Okay, anyway, so this is working. Not a bit like that, that's what I'm using, but I think from that's what I did. Okay, so perfect. So hi, I'm Stella. Like Mihaly said, Maria is joining us over Zoom, but she won't be able to talk. So you only have. Yeah, but how can we know? Only if Mihaly says anything. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Anyway, so I'm not a historian. Maria isn't a historian either. Both of us have studied marketing, and we are both working on place branding, and we are both fond of heritage. So the presentation that we have prepared for you, we still don't have a full paper, so that's why you will have to count more on what we will be talking about here today. So our presentation is going to be about a lot of the topics that have already been brought up today. It's going to be about identity, authenticity, nation branding, ethnicity, the Mediterranean, Macedonia, so different things that we have referred to already. So, but it's about names and it is about fames. And we're going to focus on a branding aspect and specifically brand consistency through the lens of identity. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about fames and Mediterranean countries as tourist destinations, then a little bit about destination branding, thinking that the background that we have here is a bit different, so maybe it's a good thing to have some common ground. And then we will talk about brand consistency, and I'm going to focus on specifically 3 countries, and we're going to talk about avenues for research, because this is mostly a conceptual paper as it stands right now. So, talking about fames. The Mediterranean countries are famous tourist destinations for years, for centuries now, because of where they are located. Pirates, trade, tourism were some of the main activities taking place over the course of years. From the Mediterranean context, we can see that there are many different countries that we're talking about, countries that have a very diverse background in terms of religion, in terms of history, in terms of heritage, but they all have the Mediterranean Sea in common, which brings some common characteristics in terms of food and some other cultural elements as well. When we look at I think it may be too small. In any case, when we look at the Travel and Tourism Development Index framework, which uses 5 dimensions, so the enabling environment, the travel and tourism policy and enabling conditions, the infrastructure, the travel and tourism demand drivers, and the travel and tourism sustainability, we see that Mediterranean countries are quite popular, and generally, especially Eurasia, Balkans, and Eastern European countries tend to be more price competitive, but Southern Eastern countries are more tourism dependent. So the economies of these countries depend a lot on tourism for all the different sectors of the development. And also what we can see is that although they are already quite high, it is expected to grow even more. So that's why it's important to focus on the historical aspect, but also on how things are today and how they should be on the way forward, so that sustainability will also have a more central role. So Mediterranean today is the world's leading tourist destination, both for international and domestic tourism. Tourism is a major form for Mediterranean economies. And historically, especially during the last part of the 1900s, the model that was mostly developed was based on sea, sand, and sun throughout most of the Mediterranean countries, regardless which one it was. When we look at global top tourist performance, we see specific areas, and we can focus when we look at measuring performance specifically. We can see which areas are do well in terms of economic performance, in terms of digital demand, in terms of CBS rating, in terms of online performance. So there are different ways actually to see how different countries across the Mediterranean, but in other places as well, bring their, build their frame around. So when we look at tourist performers in Europe, out of the 15 top European ones, 7 are European Mediterranean countries. So half of the European top performers are located in the Mediterranean. And that also tells us how big the fame of these places are in terms of tourism, the tourism component. So this is the fame part. What about names? This is where we're going to focus on destination branding as an important asset for tourism. Just for a background, so for destination branding, as even said from Socrates, it is the way to gain a good reputation by endeavoring to be what you desire to appear at the same time. So to talk about successful destination branding, there are many different concepts that we can deal with, which work together with one another. So we have identity that we have already talked about a little bit. So identity is about the self-view. How do people who are from a specific country view themselves? Image is how the visitor, the potential visitor of a country views a country, sees a country. The brand itself is how we build these impressions, and equity comes in to illustrate the competitive value of those impressions. So it's a tool that we can use to evaluate the branding strategy that we are developing, intentionally or not. So we have, as we have already discussed during the panel, I think mostly, we have many different audiences anyway, but mostly we can talk about the destination perspective and we can talk about the country perspective. So the destination perspective and the destination image is mostly associated with tourism, whereas the country perspective is more inclusive and it has to do with many more aspects. It has to do with public diplomacy, it has to do with products that are produced in a country. The people of a country who live elsewhere, so the migrants, the refugees, and so on. Anyway, so many different perspectives. So when we talk about tourism, when we talk about destinations, it's not the same as it is when we talk about the country. So the name can have a different perception depending on whether we talk about the place as a destination or we talk about the place as a country. And that is one side of it. Another side of it is that the name has also to do with some cognitive characteristics. So what do we know about the place as a destination? What do we know about the place as a country? Does it have a seat? Does it have, how is the infrastructure over there? How is the tourist infrastructure or how is the health infrastructure? It also has to do with the affective component. So how do we feel about it? Do we like it? Do we dislike it? Do we, does it make us feel relaxed, the idea of being there or not? And it also has to do with the cognitive perspective. So how do we act upon it? Are we going to go there? Are we going to buy products from that country? If somebody goes on a honeymoon, are we going to suggest France or Greece or another place? And talking also, so this is the equity perspective. So to talk about brand equity, we evaluate image, like we talked before. We evaluate loyalty, quality. So I don't want to tire you to go through this, but mostly I want to say that when we talk about equity and how we value the brand, this may differ based on the different co-creators of the brand as well. So the value of the brand may be different, just like the stakeholders building up the brand are different. So, as Michalis and Hutch have developed a couple of years ago, when we talk about the place, it is about evaluating the perceived place, the conceived place, and the lived place. And the way to do it is through the Atlas, ATLAS, Atlas framework. So by asking, thinking, listening, acting, and then speaking on behalf of the different co-creators of the place brand. I hope you're following me. So these are the names. So the names that can have different perspectives and so on. However, key to the fame and the name is actually the role of brand consistency per se. So by brand consistency, we mean in our brain and our way of thinking, how all the different elements that connect to the place and to the fame of the place are connected with one another, and they are consistent to one another. So there is no conflict, let's say, with one another. So what we want when we talk about a place brand is to actually achieve brand consistency. This is feasible by introducing heritage and by acknowledging the role of heritage. So not history, but how history and the different elements of culture and the different elements of identity as it has been before and how it is now, because it is something alive, has a meaning nowadays for the different audiences as well. So we talk about heritage and authenticity in order to increase the symbolic and emotional attachment between a brand and the consumer. So how can we make the brand relevant to what it is and to the person that it addresses to? To make it a bit clearer, let's focus on 3 specific countries. So Greece. Names. Greece has 2 names, Greece and Hellas, Greek and Hellenic. Both names exist, both in Greek and in English, but one is more popular or more relevant to the fame of the country. The other one is more relevant to internal affairs. So Greece is actually the Hellenic democracy. Whenever you visit any website, even the NTO website is not even available in English. We only talk about the Hellenic Republic throughout the different websites. Turkey. Turkey is now trying to rebrand itself. So Turkey is the English name. Turkey is how the country is pronounced in Turkish. And now, since a couple of months ago, actually, they want to use the Turkish version of the name in the English version of the name. So they want to have more consistency, to build more consistency in terms of the name of the brand for both its domestic audience and its external audiences. I'm not going to go into more because of the time thing. So the brand consistency is also relevant not only to the country context, but also to the more specific place context. And this is an example of Istanbul, which is a famous place of Turkey, which has changed its name, like other places as well, over the history of process of time. Macedonia, another country in the Mediterranean region that has changed its name after the Yugoslavian breaking, yeah. So when somebody Googles Macedonia, 2 results will come out. One will be about Macedonia, which is North Macedonia, and one of them will be Macedonia, both written the same, Wikipedia. So these are the 2 top results when you just type in Macedonia on Google. Talking about consistency, a bit confusing over here. Still, North Macedonia, they are trying to have a more consistent approach to the brand in their different websites, which are the ones that a potential visitor is more likely to visit. So in short, places change their names as history changes, as people who live in the place change. This is not something new. But also different products, even different products change their names or, so for example, over here, this is a jam from the island of Tenedos, which is now called Bosdriada. This is taken from Imbros or Gökçeada. These are the two small islands in Turkey who used to have the majority of a Greek population. But because of national policies and because of the different processes of nation building, actually, and the creation of the ethnic states, they were destinations, they were popular tourism destinations, but they changed their names for ethnic reasons, for national identity reasons. And this made them actually move away from sustainable tourism development. So for example, they had wine tourism and now they want to support more sea, sun, sand tourism. So while other Mediterranean universities are trying to move away from that because it is closer to their national identity objectives, they are trying to move that way instead. And another example of specific products, for example, because, okay, we name the countries, but the characteristics of the regions cannot really be separated based on borders. So for example, this is a label of Xinomavro, which is a very famous wine in Macedonia. It used to have a different name when using the North Macedonian language for it, but it had to be renamed in order to serve to be closer to the Greek national objectives, for example. So it breaks down from, how we can achieve actually consistency at the country level, but then how we can move forward to the local and even the product name. Because actually it's how we use branding as a bridge and how we use the name as a bridge between the heritage and between the heritage and the different audiences that we want to include in this branding and brand experience process. By the way, the name of the bridge has also been changed. This is possible, and we have examples from different places across the globe where they have been trying to embrace people who have just moved, who have migrated to these places. So we have examples from Sweden, we have examples from Australia, places that are building their identity in a way that will be inclusive and will be consistent to the brand that they want to strengthen as well. Because it's about how we use branding and the wheels that Kavaradis and Hartz have so nicely described as a vehicle to connect with the emotional engagement and with the emotional attachment of how the brand is actually perceived, how the brand is actually experienced by the different audience.
Constantinople, a long time gone. Constantinople still is turning to light on a moonlit night. Constantinople, Istanbul, Constantinople.
So in the bottom line, yeah, I didn't expect to be so loud. So anyway, because the place may change its name, but it is still the same place that evolves. So we seek to use brand consistency as the tool to actually say and describe how this can be inclusive and resilient over the course of years. Sorry for.
Thank you very much, Stella. You have touched upon various things I want to ask you about, but I will do that afterwards. So I will give the floor directly to an open discussion. Anybody who has questions. If you don't, I will ask. I'm warning you. Irene, can I give the floor to someone else before, if that's okay? Question.
Thank you. It was very inspiring, especially the first part. When you're coming from humanities, sometimes you forget these kind of slides. And this is a nice approach to remind us of important things. So what I wanted to say on top of this is some people really take this kind of business very seriously. So I wanted to bring to your attention an example from China. There is a city that was renamed completely, and now it's called Shangri-La. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's actually an attempt to boost tourism in Yunnan area. And I'm reading now, it used to be called Zhongdian.
Yeah.
And it's called Shangri-La after a name. So talking about tourism imaginaries becoming official practice. I mean, official practice is matching some very vague but strong tourism imaginaries is a real thing. So I find this rather important. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, China is, all countries actually have strong examples. Yeah, yeah. It's not, yeah. Yeah, there are different examples actually in different places, which may have different inspirations to do so. Quite often, what they do is they ignore the people of the place, actually. So, yeah. That's what is troubling us, to be honest, and that's what we're trying to do more. Yeah.
Excellent. Rory has a question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just a question about is parts of the presentation. I wasn't sure. Are you using some of these tools like these wheels? Like methodologically, is it prescriptive or descriptive? Is this kind of a model that you suggest that researchers use, or as a way to brand, as a way to actively brand?
So, okay, so this is a conceptual paper, but we're going to use them in terms of when we collect data that we're planning to do, to have as a first step for a thematic analysis afterwards. So that's how we will be using them afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. I think coming from humanities, having this kind of theories, it's foreign to us, but I think it's really important though to understand this kind of conceptual schemata that come forward, because it makes us ask the right questions. And I think that's what we are trying to do in the humanities. But going back methodologically, because I think you're right, I think these are, with the names, are top-down processes from the top. But what usually happens is that they have to reflect public mood in a way, because usually they're not taken up. You see that with street names. They may change it, but people persevere in naming it as they remember or they feel more emotionally attached. So I'm wondering methodologically, are you going to change? Because I don't think the significance here is on the consistency, but much more what it tells us about the changes. Why are they moving from one to the other? Because if we want to understand that, as you said, the cognitive, the affective, and the cognitive, then we need to know exactly when and how it happens, right? Because we don't know that. We've seen that, snapshots here and there, but is that part of the question? And not historically per se, but how and when are these changes? Because there's no consistency here. They seem to be changed. I mean, if you take Greece, I've seen all the posters, they change name every month. So there doesn't seem to be a consistency there. So it goes against these theories. And the way I was wondering, is that methodological part of the problem, or a very important question that if you answer it, it will give us a better understanding? Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Irene. The question is that, so we're going to have because we're going to be focusing on different target groups. So we're going to have one potential visitors target group and then a more domestic target group, let's say. And the potential visitors target group we're going to be interviewing is going to be more, so we will focus on American potential travelers to the specific countries that we're focusing on. And we're going to be focusing on, and we're going to be interviewing domestically people who, so from a psychological perspective, because we want to have this emotional aspect as well. And from a psychological perspective, people have the maturity, the emotional maturity to name their feelings when they reach a specific age, let's say, or something. So what we're going to do is that we're going to have, because we're going to have Americans on the other side, sorry for the bumbling. So we're going to focus on people who were on the 20-25 age group in given times of crisis, when Greece or Turkey, for example, were red listed for US travelers. And we're going to be interviewing them in terms of how the different elements of how they perceive the brand name and specific images is appreciated, is perceived, is evaluated by them. So it's not going to be on the top-down perspective, so when the countries change the names, because we could do that. We know more or less when these things happened. It's going to be more on the recipient's perspective instead.
Thank you very much. One last question for Stella.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. It's a really brief question because of mainly the examples that you used towards the end. In my mind, it also has to do about contested pasts and contested cultures, especially with historical monuments that have changed hands over time. Do you think that consistency is the way to deal with these pasts, or is it a matter of which is the dominant culture in the end?
Well, I think that, okay, it has to do with which is the dominant culture, but it also has to do, okay, it has also a lot to do with politics, internal politics as well, and who they want to be closer to internationally and specific alliances or not. It also has to do with how inclusive they want to be and how they perceive the different minorities that they may be housing, actually. And that's why I had the different examples in the end, actually, because they are good examples of how places can still maintain their national identity, but at the same time renew it because of the new identities that they are hosting. So talking about a national identity is really confusing on its own because the language is changing, the religions are changing, the family dynamics are changing. So trying to communicate at a national level something that doesn't really reflect a reality is problematic on its own. That's why some more confident, I would say, places look beyond the differences and they are trying to actually make it happen regardless of whose nationality it is that they are hosting right now.
Very interesting discussions that can continue over lunch. Now, thank you very much, Stella. That's great. And of course, Maria, since she can hear us from Athens. Now, next presenter is Andrew. Andrew, well, is coming from London here, but he will actually take us to France. where his specialty is, and we'll talk about a fascinating process of top-down development that met a lot of resistance, but he will say that better than I can. So Andrew, the floor is yours. Vamos. Can I just say to the people online that if you have a question, you can type it in the chat, and I will do my best with the help of local people here to ask and try to answer the questions. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'll be speaking today about France, taking us a little bit further west than we've been so far, to talk really about the creation of a new form of tourist community, in particular down on the south coast, on the Languedoc coast. You can see in a drawing form there. Now, visions of a modern civilization of leisure motivated the French state to reshape its margins. On the sunny south coast, by the glittering waters of the Mediterranean, the government looked to build a new haven for mass tourism. Purpose-designed resorts served by modern road and air infrastructure would attract a wealth of new visitors to spend their holidays and their savings in France. All this took place amidst a backdrop of regional economic crisis, and the reshaping of the coast in the Languedoc-Roussillon in the 1960s was a profound state project designed to help rejuvenate the region. Critics decried it as internal colonialism, however, further extending the economic exploitation of the area, displacing local communities and eroding distinct cultures and ways of life. The transformation of this so-called virgin territories in service of the national project certainly conjured imperial echoes. And even if it lacked the racialized violence of empire, its critics had every right to question this devil's bargain of development, as Hal Rothman called it. Now, this paper will offer some context to the so-called Mission Racine, which transformed the coastline before considering the messages of its critics and unpacking an example of the displacement of a local community. Now, by way of background, the most severe wine sales crisis during the Fourth Republic occurred in 1953, and this was felt acutely in the most productive wine region of France, the Languedoc-Roussillon. With the help of cooperative production, France's wine industry had returned to pre-war production volumes by 1951. Yet, despite this productive recovery, the consumption of wine never returned to pre-war levels and declined permanently after 1954. Now, the 1960s witnessed a new wave in the wine growers' organizations of the Languedoc, as young veterans returning from military service in France's Algerian War found their region just as depressed and their government seemingly as disinterested as ever. In addition to radicalizing young veterans, the Algerian War also led to an influx of Pieds Noirs rapatriés, repatriated European settlers in Algeria, further squeezing employment opportunities in the cities of the Languedoc. The summer of 1961 saw widespread activism led by figures like André Caz, you can see that's the guy there, surrounded by CRS police just up the top, the pugnacious young spokesman of the regional wine action committees, and André Castéra, this guy here, again, flanked by a guard of CRS, who was the wise head of the movement, dubbed the Christ of the Corbière. He wore the region's kind of sins on his face, his croaky old voice as he kind of lectured the crowds. Now, those vignerons, the wine growers who grew high-yield vines in the plains of the Languedoc near the coast, were most affected by this wine crisis, rather than the appellation growers, the higher quality growers, who tended to have vineyards closer to the foothills. At the same time, the minority nationalist Occitan movement was newly articulate, having been galvanized by the miners' strike in the Decazeville pit and the formation of new political organizations like the Occitan Committee of Education and Action, the COEA, and its ongoing engagement with new left politics. Now, as the great Southern historian Jean Sagnès relates, the centrally controlled Mission Racine was built upon organizations which had been created to deal with exactly those crises in the wine industry. Writing in 1956, Jules Millot, an influential professor of economics at the University of Montpellier, suggested that, quote, the Languedoc can get rich by selling 200 kilometers of the seafront to the rest of France. Now, plans to redevelop the coast ramped up in near secrecy thereafter to prevent sparking a gold rush from land and helping the state avoid competition with speculators. One of the key contacts in the small circle in which the idea began to take shape was Philippe Lamour, president of the Compagnie du Basseron-Languedoc, a semi-public company constituted by local authorities, chambers of commerce and industry, chambers of agriculture, and with significant state credits. And it was created to promote irrigation and alternate crops to the vine, trying to break the cycle of boom and bust in the region of near monoculture of the vine. So in this way, 1,200 hectares of land were purchased discreetly at the start of the 1960s, before the Mission Racine was fully announced in June 1963, after which an additional 3,000 hectares were purchased. Now, the development project was nicknamed the Mission Racine after its leader, this guy here, you can see with the rather slouchy pose. Pierre Racine was a loyal chief of staff to Prime Minister Michel Debré after General de Gaulle's return to power in the early Fifth Republic, and a big supporter of the general. Chief architect on the project, Jean Balladur, who you can see just right here. I'll show you another picture of him later. There's Racine again with Balladur. So the chief architect of the project, Balladur, had been contacted by Jacques Maziol, the newly appointed Minister of Construction in 1962. And that's Maziol here. You can see Maziol again in this little kind of beachfront tour down there as well. Now, Balladur understood his brief arose because of the impossibility of better developing a region of vine monoculture. Instead, his task was to redevelop the virgin Mediterranean coast with an aim to promoting mass tourism as an alternative development strategy. According to Racine, it was in May 1963 that the term, the New French Florida, emerged, and it was a coining that he regretted, and I quote, "When the Gaullist Jacques Maziol came to Béziers to support the majority candidate in a by-election, he unfortunately and loudly announced the development of this new Florida. The name alone offends most Languedociens." Now, Maziol was doubly unsuccessful. The Gaullist candidate lost the by-election after the left voted as a bloc against his candidate, and of course, his Florida gaffe stuck. A useful point there about the idea of branding. This idea of the French Florida offended people because it made it seem tawdry what was to be done. Now, another of the Gaullist cadre involved in the project was Olivier Guichard, this guy up here, a delegate to the Regional Development Corporation, later described as a baron of Gaullism. When he was interviewed about the project on television, he stated, and I quote, "In a civilization where talk of leisure is growing, it's normal to look for still virgin places where that civilization can develop." Now, as Jean-Didier Urban noted, the social transformation of the beach into a site of leisure and spectacle was a consequence of this kind of leisure talk. But beyond social construction, these were beach resorts in the midst of physical construction. The 6 towns to be created were not envisaged as being independent resorts, but rather part of a complementary series of beaches, a destination surrounded by large bypass roads, which came in from Avignon in the Rhone Valley and led to Bordeaux and Toulouse on the one hand and then to Perpignan in the other. This was intended to compete directly with Spain's Costa Brava, which had seen heavy development between 1950 and 1964, and to which almost 2.5 million people traveled each year, with only 11% stopping in the region of the Languedoc. Quote, tourists were seeking sun, sand, and sea in Spain and Italy, where the industry had expanded by 25%, compared with only 2% in France over a similar period. Now, when Paris Match covered the Mission Racine in 1964, the first big marketing push for the project, it wrote in lyrical mode, stating, and I quote, "Between the Pyrenees and the Camargue, new resorts with fantastic architecture have been born. All around them, zones prohibited to construction maintain the purity of the sites and untouched animal life. Coming in by Concorde from New York, you can land on the new international airfield of Béziers. With the influx of 1.5 million tourists, Languedoc and Roussillon have suddenly rediscovered prosperity. Factories were born where there were only depopulated scrublands. At the same time, on the coast, a new civilization appeared, that of leisure." Now, writing later, the magazine Nouvelle Aubes also echoed this language of something emerging from the sands and marshes infested with the mosquitoes on a wild coast where there was previously nothing. Now, talk about new civilizations and virgin territories may already be setting off alarm bells. This was an extremely statist land grab in which the phrase virgin territory was used not only by Guichard, but also by Racine and by Balladur. In the name of progress, Racine sought to clear away the, quote, wild camping sites and other temporary coastal dwellings, which he referred to as bidonvilles de vacances, kind of holiday slums. Further, using new technologies, they would transform the landscape, draining swamps and using specifically designed helicopters to spray pesticide, both with the aim of eradicating enemy number one, mosquitoes. Now, arriving at one of the sites just outside Narbonne for an official visit in 1967, Pierre Racine proudly presented this coastal development to President de Gaulle. Le Monde noted that the general looked visibly interested and quizzed some of the mayors of these nearby towns, asking, quote, "And all this doesn't bother you, Monsieur le Maire? You don't feel apprehensive? You'll accept all of this?" Now, as the general's helicopter tour continued along the coast, he arrived at La Grande Motte, the jewel in the crown of this development plan. And again, he questioned local officials before finally receiving an honest answer to the question. One mayor replied, "We are adapting as best we can." Now, this encounter offers an instructive sense of where the Mission Racine broke new ground, both literally and figuratively. As noted by Vincent André Bossu, the coast passed into the hands of technocrats, little inclined towards negotiation. Planners co-opted local elites and won them round to this grand status project using tools originally designed to address regional economic woes. Now, in October 1970, early news of the Larzac army base expansion began to circulate when Député André Fontan spoke to a UDR Gaullist Party rally in the south of France, which happened to have some local farmers in attendance. Here, he let slip the exciting news that Gaullist grandee Michel Debré, then minister charged with national defence, was planning to triple the size of the local army base, promising an economic boom for local businesses with almost no disturbance, except for a few sheep farmers supporting the production of Roquefort cheese. Fontan fired the starting gun on a long-running and storied campaign to resist exactly that expansion. Indeed, for the 103 Larzac families who refused to sell their land, many of the protests were voiced with a direct experience of the forced purchase orders which had been used in the wider region to acquire the land for the Mission Racine. Their committee warned against killing off vibrant rural communities and bringing on, quote, "the permanent disappearance of the farming population to be replaced with second homes, tourists, and retired people." Now, historian Sarah Farmer notes how new types of consumption in the 1960s and 70s juxtaposed rural charms and urban desires, with rural property magazines catering to discerning urbanites seeking their own slice of peasant life. Magazines promoting second homes also covered the Larzac struggle, strangely enough, asking readers to question whether they could allow 14th century farmhouses to be shelled for army target practice. How could one let such a bargain go to waste? Instead, the Languedoc-Roussillon had 2.25 million second homes by 1990, the highest ratio of second homes to total lodgings of any region in France. But this was not a vision of regional development, but rather one of displacement. The language of internal colonialism and comparisons to Native Americans were perhaps sometimes abused by Occitan activists trying to rally support and awaken people to their cause, though they nonetheless conveyed a strong sense of their marginalization, displacement, and unwilling cultural assimilation into a grander project of French modernity. Writing in 1974, Front Occitan, a radical magazine, juxtaposed the touristic developments alongside the forced purchases of the Larzac, seeing for Occitan people only a future of displacement and rootlessness, or subservience and impoverishment. And I quote, and apologies for the term they use here, we will return to that which we were, a lesser race, Bugnol for the Northern Europeans. They feared a region sanitized for tourist consumption, where local people were forced to serve for subsistence wages in a range of seasonal employments. Quote, "The winter will be long despite TV and pop records, or we'll be forced to walk the long road to the factories far in the north. They are transforming the spaces of our work into spaces for the leisure of others. Between natural parks, tourist development zones, and military occupation zones, Occitans will be no more than crumb catchers, window washers, museum guards, or folkloric decorations in the countryside." And you can see here the Occitan wine growers depicted in a cage on the beach alongside the signs for a French Florida, villages for sale, and fat cats smoking on the beach, while the Larzac, the same way, hemmed in for the protection of nature into this one little cage, while the army destroy the local area as well. Now, in Emotion Patrimoniale, Daniel Fabre outlined two ways of thinking about this kind of resistance to the development of land. The first he offered was the lens of a NIMBY revolt, when inhabitants reject their home being subject to external intervention, or its form or function being reshaped in the public interest. Now, this attitude, Fabre noted, rested on identification with the land and an attachment to place. Yet expanding on this, Fabre notes that patrimonial resistors were not just expressing the need to protect the object of heritage, such as a beautiful landscape for itself, but identifying themselves through that object, and thus feeling their own identity being eroded through any attack on that physical and cultural heritage. Resistance campaigns like the Larzac and the people that resisted the Mission Racine, therefore, display the heart of the patrimonial argument. The right, both personal and collective, to be oneself entwined with an objectified and localized past, either inherited or chosen. Going further, Caroline Ford in Natural Interests has demonstrated how concepts of national patrimony drove the preservation of agricultural spaces, arguing for the importance of civil society actors in negotiating the national landscape. A bit like Irene mentioned there in the comments, between the way that these visions are projected from the state, but also kind of negotiated and worked with at the local level as well. The point here is not simply the preservation of this unspoilt beauty of that landscape, nor for rural indolence, but the ongoing and vital activity of people who live and work the land they're in. Thus, the argument is not one of frozen heritage or a static image, but of an evolving and mutable future shaped by those whose connection with the intangible heritage of the landscape can direct future adaptations. And you can see here a vision of the farmer as kind of folkloric destination for the tourists, the camera in the face and all the rest of it. Here, an idea of a nightclub to which the country will become, simply, you know, in that same idea, almost like the Black Coast nightclubs, where actually local people aren't allowed in, but they're somehow the decoration as well, and this kind of constant sense of it. Now, it's the nature of these adaptations, so often externally led and impersonally led from the centre, that raises the possibility of resistance in the periphery, as I note in my book on the Languedoc's wine growers, and in a book I'm currently finishing on the Larzac struggle. As Fabre notes, many of these resistors are not simply engaging in NIMBY activism, but by associating the disappearance of activity and jobs with a collective historical death being pushed through by decision makers without memory. Some far-left Occitanist groups saw in the Mission Racine a caricature of colonisation, wherein the region was invaded by capital and people from outside, while local elites nodded along. For Robert Laffont, La Grande Motte, the biggest of those new resorts, quote, had become a symbol of this colonisation. In Front Occitan, tourism was described as neocolonialism, and the Occitan Journal explicitly paraphrased Frantz Fanon in declaring Occitanie would become, quote, the brothel of the industrialised world. They considered this form of capitalist development as inherently exploitative and denounced it on those terms. Quote, the profit a country expects from the sale of its beaches, mountains and folklore are only mirages. Modern tourism has become a heavy industry that does not benefit host countries. Jean Sagnès mentioned how reports and graffiti around some of these resorts can be seen, and actually this one here, with a photo of Jean Balladur, the chief architect of La Grande Motte, sitting in front of a thing which has been written with some French graffiti about internal colonialism, and down here some Occitan graffiti as well behind him, giving a good sense of those clashing cultures around this level of development. Now, one community displaced by the Racine development is the small town of Bourdigou, consisting mostly of straw huts built by fishermen and existing since the start of the century. It was not really like the architectural dreams of the Mission Racine. It was a small ephemeral community that represented a free space for wild camping and cheap family holidays. In 1961, the Minister of Court of Montpellier had recognized its existence, meaning that 135 listed buildings would pay local taxes. And that really was a period of growth for it thereafter, as some of the people displaced by the first coastal development works of the Mission Racine, former inhabitants of villages in Canet, Saint-Cyprien, Port-Barcarès, moved to Bourdigou. The summer population continued to increase, reaching 3,000 to 5,000 people at the beginning of the 1970s. But it was not to last. Interestingly, 7 years after the announcement of the Mission Racine, the Asterix books, Mansions of the Gods, this one here, was released, in which Caesar plans a huge seaside resort on the Armorican coast. Now, despite some small resistance organised by the Bourdigou families who'd formed a committee, Bourdigou could not hold out like the famous village of the Gauls, and it was eventually destroyed. When the clearances came, Le Monde quoted a resident, quote, fancy free and free of charge. That's how our holidays were, says a young woman. And we live better there than the HLM, the kind of high-rise council housing, basically, offered by the people of the Mission Racine. They are the savages. The national newspaper also spoke to an unnamed official from the mission. Quote, in this area, he added, we indulge in fantasies that have nothing to do with reality. All of this must be cleaned up. An interesting reference again to Christos's point at the start about that type of mess. We must improve the brand image of the coast and open it up to international tourism, end quote. Now, despite, just to wrap up, despite the polished visions of modern civilizations of leisure and the promised economic boom which would follow the redevelopment of the southern coast, the state faced resistance from those at the sharp end of the project. This oft-abused language of internal colonialism seems to fit this moment of change. The touristification of the Languedoc involved the physical seizure and reshaping of so-called virgin territories, the co-option of local notables, direct state control of investment and planning, and the displacement of marginal communities. At the very moment that the celebrated historian Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie spoke of ecological history in the journal Annales in 1974, the Languedoc, his long-time historical focus, was being transformed at its historical limits. The state's anticipated civilization of leisure butted up against landscapes of rural labour, through which Occitan activists identified themselves. In this framework of patrimonial resistance, tourists, despite the capital they brought to the region, became settlers displacing communities. In opposing this French Florida with the language of empire, Occitan activists, wine growers, and even the last bordigueros were issuing a defiant call to live and work the land. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. I thought, including the Asterix reference, the most important reference today, I am sure. Great. I don't want to take time from our lunch break. So questions and comments for the fascinating story of development and resistance in France.
Thank you for your presentation. We have been talking in the first session about crypto colonization. We are talking about internal colonization, and seems to be a constant in the conference. I was asking, well, not about the concept of colonization for our analysis, but I'm wondering about the historical perception of being colonized, at least in the 60s, no, or in the 70s, no? Not about the concept, but the historical perception from the people of the places, no? The question is very simple. How do you explain this kind of perception? But it's a tricky question because I have some answers, so I like to share because it's only proposals. Well, we can think the chronology in the 1960s, 70s. Decolonization was politically a very important question, no? And everybody in the left want to be colonized in order to struggle against colonialism, no? It could be one answer, but I think it's so simplistic. I was thinking at the same time on the economic colonization, or the economic interchange, there's equal interchange economically. But the Mallorcan experience, all the money, all the profits were in the island, because the offer were organized by Mallorcan companies. So it's not the case, but because in Mallorca it was this kind of perception of colonization. I don't know if it has something to do with culture, with the language of colonization, or with the space. You know, the uses of a space, because in the draws you have showed, you know, it was very clear that this perception of being into a prison, with the draws. So it's a very open question. It's a very open question. I don't know.
Yeah, super briefly, because it's one of these answers that could be forever. But I think, you know, absolutely, the chronology is important. The association of a minority nationalist movement, particularly with a linguistic and territorial identity in Occitanism, is reborn in the early 1960s, associated with the New Left, and in particular around a lot of the kind of intersectional social movements the New Left supports. And so they draw very strong solidarities with groups like the Mouvement des Travailleurs Arabes, with the Union Générale des Travailleurs Sénégalais en Français, the General Union of Senegalese Workers in France, who are also kind of pushing for recognition and equality within the kind of post-colonial French nation state. And so you get small minority nationalist groups forming kind of alliances with them. And places like the Larzac are very good sites for this. We have big music festivals where you can see that, not just in those kind of groups with France's empire, but I mean also, for example, they link themselves to Ireland very strongly. The Larzac military base is used by British troops who transfer from there directly to Belfast, you know, in 71, for example. So there are direct comparisons there that they draw to kind of minority nationalism and other kind of groups that feel colonized in that same way. So the language is instrumental because it's about promoting their own cause. But I think it's also based on some genuine solidarities as well that we see played out by the actions of some of these activists, which go beyond words in actual kind of solidarity initiatives. So I think there's a lot of that there. But also, of course, we have Paris, the center, always taking over the peripheries. This idea of Paris and the peripheries is a long-standing narrative in French history that goes back to the Franks and the Gauls, right back at the start. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. One more.
I have a very obvious question, and it is, I believe, already present in your paper, but I would like for you to expand on it, because at first it seemed as you were setting up attention related to the presence of the Pied Noir. So my question is, how does this discourse of, or to what extent does this discourse of anti-colonialism, neo-colonialism, colonization, is also like a reflection of the sort of social tension derived from the presence of the Pied Noir?
Yeah, hugely. First of all, with the Pied Noir rapatriés, they tend to be some of the more well-off people coming back from Algeria. The European settlers tend to find themselves right across the south, and there's a long history, both of the repatriated Pied Noir, but also someone like Claire Eldridge written some fantastic stuff on the Arquis, you know, the Algerian auxiliaries that came back to France and their memories. There's a lot of commemoration that goes on right across, especially in the Roussillon, but also in Montpellier as well, and up in Aix-en-Provence. There are real kind of hubs where you see a lot of this. Interestingly, the Larzac army base in 62, after it served as a prison for the FLN, becomes a kind of welcome center to kind of relocate people after they arrive in France. So it's tied into every side of that conflict. And there's a real sense of like real pressure and strain on resources and a huge resentment. Many of those Pied Noirs tend to be towards probably the right or extreme right of French politics. Many people we're talking about here and move towards a lot of the time the cities, rural cities, if you see what I mean, like southern cities, southern towns and cities. But then also, yeah, a lot of these movements have been driven by the left. But there's also a lot of tension in local areas between like ordinary people that live there and the sort of the Maoists and the new left, the long hairs that come down from Paris and elsewhere to come kind of find their roots, the neo-rural that kind of reimplant themselves. There is tension there as well. So yeah, a lot of tension, but it's directly related, I think, to this extremely traumatic process of France's disentanglement from empire during this kind of long process of decolonization. Yeah.
And the last question before lunch goes to
Mary. Thank you very much for the fascinating. Okay, I'm just going to make it very short. I think you actually started answering already, you know, while I was formulating the question. It's about these networks. I mean, we've been this morning looking very much from the nation, really, or, you know, domestically, etc. But you're also alluding to something I'm very interested in. I think we will be discussing these translocal networks, so translocal connections. So I'm wondering, and you've already started responding to this, if there are practices there in place. I mean, there's archives, obviously, you know, networks of solidarity or parallelisms or comparisons, but are the practices that are actually, you know, physical or meeting places, etc.?
Yeah, so the Larzac provides most of the meeting places for those. It's a decade-long resistance project which has these big music festivals, harvest festivals, which are like a French Woodstock. So they become these enormous things. 100,000 people will go and take part in these like processes of exchange and kind of all this kind of stuff. So there's big stages there for that kind of grandstanding. On a smaller scale, there still exist memory organizations for places like Bordeaux. I'm trying to track down one just now, which had an out-of-date listing in a local authorities, you know. So I'm on the hunt for this local memory association. And there are memoirs and testimonies of people that lived in Bordeaux or stayed there over summers. And so there's a real sense of trying to recreate that in this long sense. And actually, people do go back and try and build buildings. They're like little shantytown huts and so on for holidays. And every year they get torn down. So there's an actual practice there of trying to recreate something that's been destroyed. Other stuff we didn't quite mention, but like international stuff. There's a lot of international capital. France is trying to court British capital from 67. There's a French delegation that comes to the UK to seek property developers and golf companies to come and build golf courses around these wonderful new towns and all the rest of it. There's a lot of German capital there as well in terms of trying to bring it in. There's less American, but that's largely to do with the time period and de Gaulle and Franco-American relationships. More from about 1970. There's a re-engagement in that sense. But yeah, so there's a lot of kind of attempt to court that international capital and to draw those international visitors. But it very strongly remains something that is about second homes and all the rest of it. It doesn't really communicate the local. La Grande Motte that I mentioned is famous because it has these giant pyramids on the seafront. That's what Balladur builds. These like vision of modernist pyramids. And so all the different towns, they don't take like, local architecture. Interestingly, Lucat, which is one of the more successful of these local towns, the chief architect there is a guy called, he's a local connection. His name is Georges Kalidis, and he models it on a Greek influence to try and make Lucat look more Mediterranean. And actually, it remains one of the more successful. You can find a very successful branding campaign on Instagram, for example. But yeah, so there's a lot of effort to try and create these places, both as kind of tributes to modernism, but a certain idea of what a civilization of leisure can represent. And actually, probably the most successful of those are of a Mediterranean theme or vernacular of that civilization of leisure. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Ladies and gentlemen, one more time, please, for Andrew. That was great. We started 40 minutes late. We are finishing 20 minutes late. That's progress, right? So, and now lunch has been served, I imagine. So thank you very, very much for a great session. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you.